December 23rd, 1857. The air in Savannah hung thick with the scent of magnolia and something darker. Something that had been brewing for months in the shadows of the grand estates that lined the cobblestone streets. Tomorrow would be Christmas Eve, a night of celebration for some, but for others, it would become the most explosive slave revolt in Georgia's blood-soaked history. A night when the very foundations of the antebellum South would crack and bleed. The name they whispered in the quarters was Marcus. Not his slave name, the one carved into ledgers and bills of sale, but the name his mother had given him before the chains, before the brand, him to bow before the whip taught his head and swallow his rage. Marcus had spent 7 years planning what would unfold in less than 24 hours. 7 years, watching, learning, remembering every face that had smiled while children were sold, every hand that had raised the lash, every voice that had quoted scripture while flesh burned. What began as whispers between trusted souls in the rice fields would ignite into an inferno that consumed 3 plantations, left 18 masters dead, and sent shockwaves through the entire Confederate establishment. This wasn't madness. This wasn't random violence born of desperation. This was revolution, calculated and cold, orchestrated by a man who understood that freedom had to be taken, never given. But before we dive deeper into this forgotten chapter of American history, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from and what time it is there. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button because stories like these need to be told. The Whitmore plantations stretched across 2,000 acres of Georgia's most fertile soil. Cotton fields rolled like white-capped waves toward the horizon, while closer to the main house, neat rows of vegetables grew fat under the careful tending of enslaved hands. It was a monument to Southern prosperity, built on blood and sustained by brutality. The grand mansion stood 3 stories tall, its white columns gleaming in the winter sun like the teeth of some enormous predator. Inside, the Whitmore family prepared for their Christmas celebration. Margaret Whitmore, draped in silk imported from France, directed the household staff with the casual cruelty of someone who had never questioned her right to own other human beings. Her husband, Colonel James Whitmore, polished his cavalry sword while discussing politics with his brother-in-law, both men confident that their world would never change, never crack, never burn. They had no idea that in the quarters behind the kitchen, Marcus was holding his final meeting. 23 men sat in a circle, their faces illuminated by a single candle flame that danced like a spirit eager for vengeance. These weren't field hands broken by years of submission. These were craftsmen, drivers, house servants who moved through the white world like ghosts, invisible until the moment they chose to be seen. Marcus had selected each man carefully. Samuel, the blacksmith, whose powerful hands could crush windpipes as easily as they shaped iron. Joshua, the stable master who knew every horse, every path, every weakness in the plantation's defenses. Benjamin, the house butler who served dinner to men who discussed the sale of his own children as casually as they debated the weather. Each had lost something irreplaceable to the institution that claimed to civilize them while stripping away their humanity piece by bloody piece. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Christmas Eve would find the masters drunk on whiskey and arrogance, their guards down, their attention focused on celebration rather than security. The enslaved would move through the house like shadows made flesh, striking swift and silent before anyone could raise an alarm. But this wouldn't be a massacre born of blind rage. Every death had been planned, every target chosen for maximum psychological impact. Marcus stood, his voice barely above a whisper, but carrying the weight of generations of suffering. Tonight, he said, we don't just kill masters. We kill the idea that we are property. We kill the lie that we are less than human. We kill the system that turns children into commodities and mothers into breeding stock. The candle flickered, casting dancing shadows on faces that had forgotten how to hope until this moment. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows of the big house where the Whitmores slept peacefully. unaware that their world was about to end. But the Whitmore plantation was only the beginning. Marcus had spent months building a network that stretched across 3 counties, connecting enslaved communities through a web of trust and shared desperation. The revolt would spread like wildfire, jumping from plantation to plantation as coordinated groups struck simultaneously. By dawn on Christmas morning, the ruling class of coastal Georgia would wake to find their empire in ashes. The second target was the Caldwell estate, home to Judge Harrison Caldwell, a man who had sentenced more runaway slaves to death than any magistrate in the state. His plantation specialized in breeding, treating human beings like livestock to be bought, sold, and bred for profit. The judge's own house servants, led by a woman named Ruth whose 3 daughters had been sold to different states, would ensure he never rendered another verdict. Ruth had served the Caldwell family for 15 years, watching them feast while her own children went hungry, listening to them discuss her baby's market value over afternoon tea. She moved through their world with the practiced invisibility of the enslaved, but behind her downcast eyes burned a fury that would have terrified them had they possessed the humanity to recognize it. The third plantation belonged to the Morrison brothers, twin sadists who had turned cruelty into an art form. They competed with each other to devise new torments, keeping detailed records of their experiments in breaking human spirits. Their overseer, a freed black man named Thomas, who had sold his soul for a taste of power, would discover that collaboration offered no protection when the reckoning finally came. Each plantation had its own leader, its own plan, its own collection of the walking wounded who had endured unspeakable horrors while maintaining the facade of submission. They communicated through songs, through the ovla positioning undri on lines, through the seemingly random movements of field hands who carried messages encoded in gestures older than slavery itself. The network had taken years to build, growing slowly and carefully as Marcus identified those who could be trusted with the ultimate secret. Not everyone could handle the weight of what was coming. Some slaves had been so broken by the system that they would betray their own people for a scrap of approval from their masters. Others were too consumed by fear to risk everything for a chance at freedom. But those who joined the conspiracy shared something deeper than desperation. They shared a vision of what America could become if the chains were broken, if the whips were turned on those who wielded them, if the enslaved became the masters of their own destiny. They understood that this wasn't just about revenge, though revenge would taste sweet after years of swallowed humiliation. This was about transformation, about taking a society built on the premise that some humans were property and burning it down to the foundations. About proving that no amount of violence could permanently break the human spirit, that dignity could survive any assault, that freedom was not a gift to be granted, but a birthright to be claimed. Marcus had studied the great slave revolts of history, learning from both their successes and their failures. He knew that previous uprisings had failed, not because the enslaved lacked courage, but because they lacked coordination. They struck too early, trusted too widely, or failed to account for the overwhelming military advantage of their oppressors. This revolt would be different. It would be surgical in its precision, devastating in its impact, and impossible to suppress before the message spread far beyond Georgia's borders. The enslaved communities of the entire South would learn that resistance was possible, that masters could bleed, that the system that seemed so permanent was actually as fragile as morning frost. As Christmas Eve approached, the final preparations fell into place. Weapons had been hidden, routes planned, signals arranged. The enslaved moved through their daily routines with the same outward compliance they had always shown. But underneath the surface, revolution pulsed like a second heartbeat. The masters noticed nothing. Why would they? In their minds, slaves were incapable of complex thought, let alone coordinated action. They saw what they expected to see. Docile servants grateful for the privilege of bondage, children who needed the firm guidance of their superiors to function in the world. This blindness would prove fatal. They had created a system so dehumanizing that they could no longer recognize humanity when it stared them in the face. They had convinced themselves so thoroughly of their own superiority that they never imagined their property might be planning their destruction. December 24th arrived grey and cold, with clouds hanging low over the Georgia coast like a funeral shroud. In the Whitmore mansion, servants prepared the master's dress Christmas feast while they'd in their finest clothes, ready to celebrate another year of prosperity built on human suffering. The irony was lost on them that they would mark the birth of a man who preached liberation while dining on the fruits of bondage. Margaret Whitmore inspected the dining room with the critical eye of someone accustomed to perfection purchased with other people's pain. The crystal gleamed, the silver sparkled, and the enslaved moved silently between the rooms like well-trained ghosts. She had no idea that several of those ghosts carried death in their hearts and steel in their hands. Colonel Whitmore gathered with his guests in the parlour, brandy warming their bellies and lies warming their souls. They spoke of politics and profit, of the natural order that placed them at the apex of creation and their slaves at the bottom. They quoted scripture to justify their brutality and economics to rationalise their cruelty. They were educated men who had convinced themselves that wisdom lay in the systematic destruction of human dignity. But in the quarters, a different kind of education was taking place. Marcus made his final rounds, visiting each group of conspirators, looking into eyes that had learned to hide their thoughts from white observation. These men had been taught to read the weather, to predict the moods of their masters, to survive by anticipating violence before it arrived. Now they would use those same skills to deliver violence of their own. The blacksmith Samuel had prepared more than horseshoes in his forge. Hidden beneath the coals were blades sharpened to razor edges, iron rods weighted for crushing bone, tools of liberation disguised as instruments of labour. His massive hands, scarred by years of working red-hot metal, would soon work a different kind of heat on flesh that had never known the kiss of the lash. Joshua had spent days studying the patrol routes, memorizing the timing of the guards, identifying the weak points in the plantation's defences. He knew which dogs would bark, and which could be silenced, which gates creaked, and which opened smooth as silk. The same knowledge that kept him alive as a slave would now serve to end the lives of his oppressors. Benjamin had served dinner to the Whitmore family for 8 years, invisible as furniture as they planned the sale of his sister, the punishment of his friends, the breeding of his neighbours. He had watched them laugh at jokes about slave stupidity while he calculated interest rates in his head, had seen them debate the humanity of his people while he spoke 3 languages they couldn't pronounce. Tonight, his invisibility would become their blindness. He would move through the house like smoke, opening doors that should have been locked, silencing alarms that should have been raised, creating the very chaos that would allow his brothers to complete their work. The butler who had served their meals would serve their deaths with the same quiet efficiency. At the Caldwell plantation, Ruth gathered her own team of house servants who had watched their children disappear into the machinery of human trafficking. These women had cleaned blood from floors, had washed the clothes of men who raped their daughters, had prepared meals for judges who sentenced their sons to death. They had survived by becoming invisible, by swallowing their rage until it fermented into something harder than steel. Judge Caldwell sat in his study, reviewing cases for the new year, unaware that his final judgment was walking up the stairs behind him. Ruth carried a silver tray with his evening brandy, the same tray she had used to serve him for a decade. But tonight, the brandy would be his last taste of earthly pleasure before he discovered what justice looked like when delivered by those he had condemned. The Morrison plantation buzzed with its own preparations. The twin brothers had invited guests from across the county to witness their latest innovation in human degradation, a Christmas entertainment that would demonstrate new techniques in breaking spirits. They had no way of knowing that the entertainment would be provided by their own slaves, and that the breaking would be done to different spirits entirely. Their overseer Thomas paced the grounds, his whip coiled at his side like a sleeping serpent. He had sold his soul for the privilege of wielding power over his own people, had become the instrument of white supremacy in exchange for scraps of authority. But authority built on betrayal was as fragile as ice in summer, and tonight the temperature would rise beyond his ability to control. As darkness fell, the enslaved communities across 3 counties began their final preparations. Weapons were retrieved from hiding places, signals were exchanged between plantations, and prayers were whispered to gods who had watched their people suffer for generations. This wasn't just a revolt against individual masters, but against the entire system that had turned human beings into commodities. The conspirators understood that success meant more than killing their oppressors. They had to strike fear into the heart of every slaveholder in the South, had to prove that the institution of slavery carried within it the seeds of its own destruction. They had to demonstrate that no amount of violence could permanently break the human spirit. That dignity could survive any assault if the will to resist remained strong. Marcus stood at the center of it all, a man transformed by years of planning and preparation. He had studied military tactics in stolen moments, had learned to read by trading food for lessons, had memorized maps by tracing them in dirt that was swept away before dawn. He had become a general without an army, a strategist without recognition, a revolutionary without a country to call his own. But tonight, he would claim his country. Tonight, he would lead his people out of bondage, not through divine intervention, but through human action. Tonight, he would prove that freedom was not a gift to be granted by benevolent masters, but a birthright to be seized by those brave enough to reach for it. The clock in the Whitmore mansion chimed 9 times, its bronze voice echoing through halls that had witnessed countless horrors. In 12 hours, those same halls would echo with different sounds, sounds that would haunt the nightmares of every slaveholder who survived to tell the tale. The Christmas Eve massacre was about to begin, and with it, the most explosive chapter in the long struggle for human dignity would unfold in blood and fire across the Georgia coast. The clock's final chime dissolved into silence, but beneath that stillness, something ancient stirred. In the slave quarters of 3 plantations, men and women who had been branded, beaten, and broken began to transform into something their masters had never imagined possible. They became soldiers in a war that had been raging in their hearts for generations. Marcus moved through the Whitmore quarters, like a shadow with purpose. His bare feet made no sound on the packed earth as he passed from cabin to cabin, offering no words of encouragement, no speeches about freedom or justice. These people had lived those words in reverse for too long to need reminders. Instead, he simply looked into their eyes, and in that look passed the weight of collective memory, the accumulated rage of stolen children and murdered dreams. Sarah, who had watched her baby sold at 8 months old, wrapped a kitchen knife in cloth and tucked it beneath her apron. Her hands had prepared thousands of meals for the family that destroyed hers, had kneaded bread while her heart needed hatred. Tonight, those same hands would prepare a different kind of feast. Old Moses, whose back carried the roadmap of every overseer's cruelty for 60 years, tested the weight of an iron rod in his gnarled fingers. He had outlived 3 generations of Whitmores, had buried more friends than any man should, had watched the institution of slavery evolve and adapt but never die. Tonight, he would help it take its final breath. The house servants moved first. They had access. They had trust. They had the keys that would unlock more than doors. Benjamin glided through the mansion's corridors with the practiced invisibility of the enslaved, but his eyes now catalogued weak points instead of dust, escape routes instead of cobwebs. The same architectural knowledge that made him an efficient servant would make him a lethal revolutionary. In the kitchen, Sarah began her final meal preparation, but instead of Christmas pudding, she arranged the tools of liberation. Carving knives sharp enough to split bone, meat cleavers weighted for crushing skulls, iron skillets that could cave in a man's face with a single swing. Every implement that had served the master's comfort would now serve their destruction. Margaret Whitmore called from the parlour, her voice carrying that particular tone of casual command that assumed instant obedience. Sarah answered with the same deferential, "Yes, ma'am," she had practiced for 15 years. But the words tasted different now. They carried the flavour of endings. The dining room gleamed with silver and crystal, each piece reflecting the candlelight like tiny stars in a constellation of wealth built on human suffering. The Whitmore family and their guests would gather here in 1 hour for their Christmas Eve dinner, never suspecting that the table had been set for their last supper. Colonel Whitmore entertained his brother-in-law with war stories, tales of cavalry charges and Confederate glory that painted slavery as a noble institution threatened by Northern aggression. He cleaned his cavalry sword as he spoke, the blade catching the firelight with each stroke of the polishing cloth. The irony that he was preparing the very weapon that would be used against him was lost in his arrogance, but across 3 counties, similar scenes played out with deadly precision. At the Caldwell plantation, Ruth climbed the stairs to the judge's study, silver tray balanced in hands that had learned perfect steadiness through years of fear. Judge Caldwell sat behind his mahogany desk, reviewing death sentences with the same casual attention most men gave to dinner menus. He had condemned so many to die that death had become paperwork, signatures on documents that transformed human beings into legal abstractions. Ruth knocked once, softly, and entered when his distracted voice granted permission. He didn't look up from his papers as she set the brandy on his desk, didn't notice that her hands no longer trembled in his presence. The judge who had built his career on reading the guilt in black faces had lost the ability to recognize revolution when it stood 3 feet away. The Morrison plantation hummed with its own deadly preparations. The twin brothers had gathered their guests in the main hall, eager to display their latest techniques in human degradation. They had constructed what they called educational demonstrations, showcasing methods for breaking rebellious spirits that they planned to market to other plantations. Their guests sipped wine and discussed the finer points of psychological torture as if they were debating agricultural techniques. Thomas, the overseer who had betrayed his own people for a taste of power, supervised the preparations with the zealousness of the recently converted. He had convinced himself that his collaboration made him different, that his willingness to whip his own kind elevated him above them. But tonight, he would learn that there are some betrayals that no amount of service can erase. The enslaved workers moved through their assigned tasks with mechanical precision, but beneath the surface, signals passed like electrical current. A glance held too long, a gesture that seemed casual but carried coded meaning. The positioning of tools that appeared random but followed a predetermined pattern. They had learned to communicate in the language of the oppressed, a vocabulary written in silence and spoken through survival. As 10 o'clock approached, the final phase began. Marcus positioned his teams with the precision of a military commander, each group assigned specific targets based on their skills and access. The blacksmiths would handle the overseers, men whose bodies were hardened by violence and required brute force to overcome. The house servants would neutralize the masters, using their intimate knowledge of routines and blind spots to strike before alarms could be raised. The kitchen staff would control the weapons, ensuring that every blade, every poker, every tool that could be turned to deadly purpose was in revolutionary hands. The stable hands would secure the horses, preventing escape while providing mounts for the spread of rebellion to neighboring plantations. Every role had been planned, every contingency considered. Samuel hefted his hammer, the same tool he had used to shoe horses and repair plows. But tonight, it would repair something more fundamental, the balance between oppressor and oppressed that had been skewed for centuries. His powerful arms, developed through years of working iron, would reshape more than metal before dawn broke. Joshua moved through the stables, calming horses with the same gentle touch he had always used. The animals trusted him, responded to his voice, followed his lead without question. Soon, their riders would need that same trust as the revolution spread beyond the boundaries of individual plantations into a conflagration that would consume the entire system. The wind picked up, rattling windows and sending Spanish moss swaying like ghostly dancers in the moonlight. The weather seemed to sense the approaching storm, the atmospheric pressure dropping as if the very air knew that violence was coming. In the quarters, children who had learned to sleep through the sounds of suffering would soon learn to sleep through the sounds of justice. Margaret Whitmore inspected her table settings one final time, adjusting crystal glasses and silver forks with the obsessive precision of someone who had never questioned her right to own the hands that polished them. She wore a silk gown imported from Paris, jewelry crafted from gold mined by enslaved hands, perfume distilled from flowers picked by children who would never smell freedom. Every luxury that adorned her had been purchased with human suffering, and tonight that debt would be collected in full. The dinner bell chimed across the plantation, its bronze voice calling the masters to their feast. But in the quarters, different bells were ringing, not bronze or silver, but the iron clang of tools being lifted, the whispered prayers of people who had finally found their moment, the collective heartbeat of a revolution that had gestated for generations in the wombs of oppression. Marcus checked his pocket watch, a gift from a master who had died the previous year, from what the doctor called natural causes, but what Marcus knew was poison administered slowly over months. Time moved differently for the enslaved, measured not in hours and minutes, but in lashes and sails, in children lost, and dignity stripped away piece by bloody piece. But tonight, time belonged to them. 11 o'clock. The masters gathered in their dining rooms, glasses raised in toasts to prosperity and tradition, unaware that both were about to end forever. They laughed at jokes about slave stupidity, while revolution bloomed in the minds of those they had underestimated. They quoted scripture about obedience, while their property prepared to deliver the kind of divine justice that no earthly court would ever provide. The candles flickered in their holders, wax dripping like tears onto tables that had witnessed countless horrors. But these would be different tears, shed not by victims, but by those who had finally found the strength to become something more. The enslaved had learned patience from their suffering, had developed the kind of endurance that only comes from surviving the unsurvivable. Now they would use those hard-won skills to endure their masters' deaths. Ruth stood outside Judge Caldwell's study, listening to him shuffle papers and mumble legal precedents. He was reviewing cases that would never be heard, sentences that would never be carried out, laws that would die with the men who enforced them. Through the crack beneath the door, she could see the shadow of his feet beneath his desk, the same feet that had walked over the graves of her children without breaking stride. The Morrison brothers raised their glasses to toast their Christmas entertainment, their faces flushed with wine and anticipation of the cruelties they planned to inflict. They had made an art of human degradation, had elevated suffering to a science, had convinced themselves that their brutality served some higher purpose. But art could be destroyed, science could be disproven, and purposes could be perverted until they consumed those who pursued them. At the Whitmore plantation, Colonel Whitmore carved the Christmas goose with his cavalry sword, the blade slicing through flesh with practiced ease. His guests applauded the theatrical display, entertained by the violence that wealth could transform into performance. They had no way of knowing that the next flesh to taste that steel would be their own, that their applause was the sound of their own funeral march. Benjamin moved through the dining room like smoke made solid, refilling glasses and clearing plates with the mechanical efficiency of the perfectly trained servant. But his eyes recorded everything: who sat where, who drank fastest, who would be slowest to react when the moment came. Knowledge was power, and tonight the enslaved would demonstrate just how much they had learned from their years of careful observation. The clock struck 11:30, and across 3 plantations, the final preparations reached their crescendo. Weapons were distributed, positions taken, prayers whispered to gods who had watched their people suffer for too long. This wasn't just revenge, though revenge would taste sweet after years of swallowed humiliation. This was transformation. the moment when property became people, when victims became victors, when the long arc of history finally bent toward justice with the help of human hands. Marcus stood at the center of it all, no longer the broken boy who had been sold away from his mother, no longer the field hand who had learned to hide his intelligence behind a mask of compliance. He had become something new, something dangerous, something that the institution of slavery had created but could never control. He was revolution incarnate, the living embodiment of every dream of freedom that had ever been whispered in the dark. The wind howled through the Spanish moss, carrying with it the scent of change, the electricity of approaching storm, the iron taste of blood not yet spilled but already promised. In 12 hours, the sun would rise on a different world, one where the enslaved had proven that no amount of violence could permanently break the human spirit, that dignity could survive any assault, that freedom was not a gift to be granted, but a birthright to be claimed with fire and steel. The Christmas Eve massacre was about to begin, and with it would come the birth of something that slaveholders had always feared but never believed possible, the day when their property would own them. The grandfather clock in the Whitmore mansion struck 11:45, each bronze note falling like a hammer on an anvil. In 15 minutes, the Christmas Eve dinner would begin. In 30 minutes, it would end in ways that no guest could imagine. The masters sat in their parlor, brandy warming their bellies while lies warmed their hearts. They spoke of cotton prices and congressional votes, of the natural order that placed them at civilization's peak, while their slaves scraped bottom like sediment in a river of human cruelty. Colonel Whitmore polished his cavalry sword one final time, the blade catching firelight like captured lightning. He had carried this steel through battles where he claimed to fight for honor, never acknowledging that honor built on bondage was no honor at all. Tonight, that same steel would taste a different kind of warfare, one where the enemy had lived under his roof for years, invisible as shadows, patient as death itself. Margaret Whitmore swept into the dining room wearing silk that cost more than most families earned in a decade. Her jewelry caught the candlelight, each diamond and ruby a frozen tear of the children who had died mining them. She inspected her table with the critical eye of someone who had never questioned why others served while she was served, why others bled while she was bathed in luxury. The enslaved moved through their final preparations with the precision of a clock's inner workings. Every gesture had been rehearsed, every movement calculated for maximum impact. Samuel tested the weight of his hammer in hands that had shaped iron for 20 years, but tonight would reshape something far more fundamental. The same strength that had bent metal to his will would bend history to justice's demand. Ruth climbed the stairs to Judge Caldwell's study, her footsteps silent on wood polished by generations of enslaved hands. The silver tray she carried held brandy aged in barrels coopered by men who would never taste freedom, served in crystal blown by artisans who died in poverty, while their work decorated the tables of tyrants. But tonight, the service would flow in reverse. Judge Caldwell sat hunched over his desk, reviewing death sentences with the casual attention most men gave to breakfast menus. His pen scratched across parchment, each signature transforming human beings into legal abstractions, living souls into dead letters. He had convinced himself that law was justice, that his verdicts carried divine authority, rather than human prejudice wrapped in Latin phrases and leather bindings. The Morrison plantation buzzed with anticipation as the twin brothers prepared their Christmas entertainment. They had invited neighboring planters to witness their latest innovations in human degradation, techniques they planned to patent and sell like agricultural equipment. Their guests sipped imported wine while discussing the finer points of psychological torture, as if debating livestock breeding or crop rotation. Thomas paced the grounds with his whip coiled at his side, the leather still stained with blood from that morning's discipline session. He had betrayed his own people for the privilege of inflicting pain professionally, had sold his soul for the right to wield power over those who shared his skin but not his choices. Tonight he would learn that collaboration offered no protection when the reckoning finally arrived. The wind picked up strength, sending Spanish moss dancing like hanged men in the moonlight. Storm clouds gathered on the horizon, their bellies swollen with rain that would wash away more than dust before dawn broke. The very atmosphere seemed to sense the approaching violence, pressure dropping as if the sky itself was holding its breath. Marcus moved through the quarters one final time, his bare feet silent on earth packed hard by generations of suffering. He spoke no words of encouragement, offered no speeches about freedom or justice. These people had lived those concepts in reverse for too long to need reminders. Instead, he simply looked into their eyes, and in that exchange passed the weight of collective memory, the accumulated rage of stolen children and murdered dreams. In the kitchen, Sarah arranged her tools with the same care she had once used for Christmas preparations. But instead of carving knives for goose, she positioned blades for throats. Instead of serving spoons for pudding, she readied iron ladles for crushing skulls. Every implement that had served the master's comfort would now serve their destruction. Each utensil transformed from symbol of service into instrument of liberation. Old Moses tested an iron rod in fingers gnarled by 6 decades of unpaid labor. His back carried the topography of every overseer's cruelty, scars layered like sedimentary rock recording each season of pain. He had outlived 3 generations of Whitmores, had buried more friends than any human should, had watched slavery evolve and adapt but never die. Tonight, he would help it breathe its last. The stable hands moved through their duties with practiced efficiency, but their eyes now catalogued escape routes instead of feed schedules, weak points in fences instead of weak spots in harnesses. Joshua whispered to horses that trusted his voice, calming them for the chaos that would soon engulf the plantation like wildfire through drought-dry cotton. Benjamin glided through the mansion's corridors with the invisibility of the perfectly trained servant, but his mind now mapped targets instead of tasks, calculated timing instead of table settings. He had served the Whitmore family for 8 years, invisible as furniture while they planned the sale of his sister, the breeding of his neighbors, the punishment of his friends. Tonight, his invisibility would become their blindness. The dinner bell chimed across the plantation grounds, its bronze voice summoning the masters to their feast. They rose from their chairs with the satisfied confidence of men who had never imagined their property might possess the intelligence to plot, the coordination to plan, the courage to act. Their arrogance had blinded them to the revolution brewing in their own kitchens, the storm gathering in their own quarters. Margaret Whitmore took her husband's arm as they processed toward the dining room, her silk gown rustling like autumn leaves about to fall. She had never worked a day in her life, had never felt the bite of hunger or the sting of the lash, had never wondered what dreams died behind the downcast eyes of those who served her meals and washed her clothes and raised her children while their own were sold like livestock. The guests followed in a parade of wealth and arrogance, men who had built fortunes on human suffering and convinced themselves they were civilizing savages. They wore their cruelty like fine tailoring, their brutality like expensive cologne, their indifference to human dignity like jewelry that caught the light and threw it back, fractured into rainbow fragments that revealed nothing of the darkness beneath. Colonel Whitmore took his place at the head of the table, cavalry sword laid across his lap like a scepter of authority. He had fought in wars where he claimed to defend freedom while enslaving millions, had quoted liberty while denying it to others, had sworn oaths to constitutions that declared all men created equal while treating some as livestock. The contradictions never troubled his sleep because he had learned to mistake power for righteousness. The enslaved servants moved through the dining room like ghosts made flesh, filling glasses and arranging plates with mechanical precision. But beneath their masks of compliance, revolution pulsed like a second heartbeat. They had learned to read their master's moods, to anticipate their needs, to survive by predicting violence before it arrived. Now, they would use those same skills to deliver violence of their own. Ruth stood outside Judge Caldwell's study, listening to him shuffle through papers that represented years of legal brutality disguised as jurisprudence. His verdicts had torn families apart, had sent innocent men to gallows, had given legal sanction to every cruelty the system could devise. Through the crack beneath the door, she could see the shadow of his feet beneath his desk, the same feet that had walked over the graves of her children without breaking stride. The Morrison brothers raised their glasses in a toast to their Christmas entertainment, faces flushed with wine and anticipation of the cruelties they planned to inflict. They had made an art of human degradation, had elevated suffering to a science, had convinced themselves that their brutality served some higher purpose in the grand design of racial hierarchy. But art could be destroyed, science could be disproven, and purposes could be perverted until they consumed those who pursued them. At exactly midnight, the revolution would begin, not with trumpets or battle cries, but with the quiet efficiency of people who had learned patience through suffering, who had developed endurance through surviving the unsurvivable, who had transformed their pain into purpose and their rage into precision. The enslaved would prove that no amount of violence could permanently break the human spirit, that dignity could survive any assault, that freedom was not a gift to be granted, but a birthright to be claimed. Marcus checked his pocket watch, stolen from a master who had died the previous year from what doctors called natural causes, but what the quarters knew was justice administered slowly through meals seasoned with more than salt. The hands pointed to 11:58, 2 minutes before the moment that would divide history into before and after, into the time when slaves were property and the time when property became people. The candles flickered in their silver holders, wax dripping like tears onto mahogany tables that had witnessed countless horrors. But these would be different tears, shed not by victims, but by those who had finally found the strength to transform suffering into action, oppression into opportunity, bondage into the kind of freedom that had to be taken rather than given. Across 3 plantations, the enslaved took their positions with the coordination of a military operation planned by generals who had learned strategy through survival, tactics through terror, warfare through the daily battle of maintaining humanity in an inhuman system. They carried weapons forged in secret, sharpened in silence, blessed by prayers whispered to gods who had watched their people suffer for too long. The wind howled through Spanish moss like the voices of ancestors calling for justice, like the cries of children sold away from their mothers, like the last words of men who died under the lash. Storm clouds gathered overhead, pregnant with rain that would wash more than dust from the earth before morning, broke over a world forever changed. 11:59. The masters raised their glasses in final toasts to prosperity built on bones, to tradition rooted in terror, to a way of life that had convinced them they were civilized while practicing barbarism as refined as their manners. They had no idea that their property had been studying them for years, learning their weaknesses, mapping their fears, preparing for this moment with the patience of people who understood that justice delayed was not justice denied. The clock struck 12 times, each chime falling like an executioner's axe. Christmas Day had arrived, but it would be born in blood rather than celebrated in joy. The enslaved moved from shadows into action, from compliance into rebellion, from property into the kind of human agency that slaveholders had always feared but never believed possible. The Christmas Eve massacre had begun, and with it came the transformation that would prove revolution could bloom in the darkest soil, that freedom could grow from the deepest roots of oppression, that the human spirit could not be permanently broken no matter how much violence was used to try. The first strike came without warning, silent as prayer in an empty church. Benjamin moved through the Whitmore dining room with the same practiced invisibility he had perfected over 8 years of service. But now each step carried the weight of revolution. The masters laughed at some crude joke about slave intelligence, while their most intelligent property positioned himself behind Colonel Whitmore's chair, carving knife gleaming like captured starlight in his steady hand. Margaret Whitmore reached for her crystal wine glass, fingers adorned with rings that had never known honest work, never felt the burn of cotton or the bite of iron shackles. She was commenting on the excellence of the goose preparation when Benjamin's blade found the soft flesh beneath her husband's jaw, opening a smile that stretched from ear to ear in a grin that would never close. The Colonel's blood sprayed across the white tablecloth like abstract art painted in crimson, each droplet carrying the weight of every lash he had ordered, every family he had torn apart, every dream he had crushed beneath the heel of his authority. His cavalry sword clattered to the floor, its steel singing one final note before falling silent forever. The other guests froze in tableau, crystal glasses suspended halfway to lips that would never taste wine again. Their minds struggled to process what their eyes were seeing, to reconcile the image of their property wielding death with surgical precision against masters who had always seemed untouchable, immortal, divinely protected by the natural order they claimed God himself had ordained. Sarah burst through the kitchen door, like a venging fire made flesh, iron skillet raised above her head like a warhammer forged in the furnaces of accumulated rage. She had cooked for these people for 15 years, had smiled while serving meals to the family that sold her babies, had seasoned their food with salt and her own tears. Tonight, she would season their deaths with something harder than grief, sharper than loss. The Savannah Christmas Eve Revolt of 1857 remains buried in archives that few dare disturb, erased from textbooks that prefer their history sanitized and their heroes white. But in the shadows between documented lies and whispered truths, Marcus and his army of the invisible proved that revolution doesn't always announce itself with trumpets. Sometimes it speaks in the language of kitchen knives and iron hammers, in the patient fury of those who learn to survive by serving death on silver platters. Their blood still stains the soil of coastal Georgia, mixed now with centuries of rain and Spanish moss, but their names echo in places where power fears to listen. They wrote their Declaration of Independence not on parchment, but in the screams of masters who discovered that property could think, could plan, could kill with the same precision they had used to destroy families and souls. If this story lit something in your chest, something that burns like truth in a world built on lies, then subscribe to this channel, hit that notification bell, and share this with someone who needs to hear that resistance has always been possible. Because stories like these don't just need to be told, they need to be remembered, carried forward like torches in the darkness, passed down like weapons forged in the fires of those who refused to die as slaves.